Welcome back to Communicology. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate any chance I can get to get those YouTube algorithms kind of hopping along in my direction. But anyway, today I'd like to talk about something kind of special, because this is episode 50, and most podcasts don't make it to 50 episodes. So let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's the subject matter of my doctoral dissertation. And that's a term that I came up with called the megaphone of the soul. Now, this isn't some pretentious term that's meant to put me in the upper echelons of academia. What it is meant to do is to talk about something that's a little bit more abstract and make it a little bit more concrete and understandable. So when you think about the concept of studying communication, especially communication technologies, and that could be something as electronic like a phone or a camera, or it could be something manual like a pen. But any way that we can communicate with any kind of technology, that basically broadcasts who we are. So you think about the idea of the soul, and not to get too theological with the concept of soul, but you think about the idea of who we are as a person, how that's reflected, how that's projected outward. The core nexus of what it is, it's what we think of as the soul. And the soul then projects forward to other people, and they see who we are. They see what we're interested in. They see what we think, what we do, because we either open our mouths or we do actions or whatever we do. And the idea of communication technology as the megaphone of our souls, that's one of those things I was thinking about more and more, because you think about how people have changed once they get a pen in their hand, or once they get a phone in their hand, or once they start dabbling on social media. There's a term I came up with several years ago, and when I think about the idea of how people act online versus how they act in person, I came up with the concept of e-muscles. So you think of the idea of, if I am a very guarded person in public, and then online I turn into this vile monster, and I say all kinds of mean things, and I talk all kinds of smack and insult people. Well, why would I do that? The concept that I was dabbling with at the time of e-muscles is that online, look at me, I can show off my guns, and then when it comes down to in real life, if I were to say that, well, you might punch me in the face, and that's not exactly something I'm looking forward to. I don't welcome punches to my face, But online, what are you going to do? Find me? I'm one of 8 billion people in the world. You narrow it down to America, I'm one of 330 million. Even if you narrow it down to my state, you're still narrowing it down to 12 million people. Good luck, So you can't find me as easily, but boy, when it comes to online, I can be tough. So that was the concept of e-muscles that really started getting me down this path of the megaphone of the soul. So I started thinking about how we do that. Now, that's not, I'm not the only one studying this, because there's been lots of discussion, lots of really good academic work on the real self, or the actual self, versus the virtual self. If you go back even further, you go back into like work like by Hannah Arendt in the 1900s, going through especially in the 1960s, the idea that you have this, this public self and a social self and a private self. So all these different ways that we are, how we project ourselves in public, in private, and in social situations. So, and again, you go further back and further back and further back and keep looking at that kind of work. But then when you move into modern communication technologies, contemporary communication technologies, especially things like, our current social media landscape that we have, there's been a lot of good work that's been done on the idea of virtual selves. Because a lot of times people project things like who they are, but online they have a different persona than they are in real life. And again, this isn't purely with that, because I remember, 10 years ago teaching classes, and people were talking about how pictures in magazines would be digitally retouched just so people could look different on that landscape as opposed to in real life. Because in real life, very few people look as good as people in magazines do. So that gets all retouched, and maybe they want to project a certain look or a certain feel, so they'll retouch it and create a different persona. And again, that's a communication technology, a magazine is. So you have the idea of this virtual self versus the real self. And so I want to take that a little bit further and start thinking about, like, well, are they really that different? And we've seen actually a lot of change, because people were typically a decade, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, more polite in person than they were online. So my concept of e-muscles rang true. But we've seen over time that wall's kind of come down. We've seen a lot of incivility in like real life, not just this fake virtual world that we play in, but in real life. And we start wondering, oh, who really are you when we interact with somebody else? When you act that way online, okay, whatever, it's online. People act like that online. We get it. But then when they act, that way in person, we're a little bit confused, because we kind of expect and count on a civil society, because we are, social animals, as Aristotle would call us. We are people of the polis, the people of the community. We need this. I mean, go all the way back, to beginning of Genesis in the Bible. Man is not meant to be alone. So we count on this idea of being, able to communicate with each other and get along. We need civil society for society to work. But what about when that breaks down? Is that a weird function of things? And people look at it and say, yeah, it's that social media causing it. I tend to disagree, because, the problem with saying it's social media causing it is the whole notion that it's social media's fault. The idea of the devil made me do it kind of comes into play here. But people have been rude jerks for a very long time. But also, I'm focusing on the negative, but people also do good things on social media. People do good things in real life. Well, who are you? When you think about that kind of thing, who are you? And this is where we get into the notion of soul. So the idea of like the real person that I am. We use the word integrity. You are aware of that word, and you think what that means. Well, if you think of the root of that word, like integrated, the idea that things are all together. So someone with integrity, someone who has it all together. And that's something that we just tend to not think too deeply about anymore, because we just are so easy to snip and snipe at each other, not just in the virtual world, but in the real world too. So why then this new metaphor, megaphone of the soul? Because quite frankly, when I am in the public sphere, so going all the way back to, ancient Greece, and I'm in the polis and I get a chance to speak, and, that was Aristotle's concept of the proper functioning polis, is that you go into the public sphere, you engage your community, you care to speak and you care to talk. So when I go into the public sphere, what I have is this. I've got my mouth and I can talk. So that's what I have. That's what I've got going for me, just my mouth. And I can be loud. I've had, pretty big classes. The biggest class I've ever taught, I think, is 76 students without any kind of microphone or anything. So you got to project pretty well to talk to a class that big in a pretty big open room. And that's nothing. I mean, you go back to, days like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when there's no amplification systems, you just have to learn and train your voice to be much louder, to be able to speak to 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 people in an auditorium, but that's just the maximum my voice can go. Then maybe I learn, how to use a microphone, and I can project it to maybe an arena. But at the end of the day, it's still fairly contained. But thanks to things like telephones and social media, I can now reach the globe in a millisecond. That's kind of humbling when you think about it, but it's also very, dare I say, arrogant. The idea that, one, the world needs to know what I'm thinking, or that I dare, think that the world needs to hear what I'm thinking. But it's also, like I said, humbling, because, wow, what I say can get out there and go pretty far. So obviously we see all kinds of ramifications for that. I can say good things and the world will know. I can say bad things and the world will know. I could be mean. I can be sorrowful. I can be happy. I can be joyous. There's all different ways I can, express who I am, as a person and also my emotion at the time, through these communication technologies. And again, I talk about the phone and the internet, but I can do the same thing with a pen and write, a sternly worded letter, an op-ed that goes in the newspaper and let it go across the country and that. But still, the point is, I have this new way of broadcasting who I am, like a megaphone. So when you think of like the old school cheerleading megaphone, you get this big, cone-shaped thing I can hold up to my mouth and then I can just broadcast to the world. And, because if I'm doing the cheerleading megaphone thing, if I'm standing at the sideline and I'm trying to get the crowd riled up, me by myself, it's hard. So you put that megaphone up and all of a sudden I can now focus my mouth, as it were, my intentions, as it were, to everybody in the crowd. Well, with social media, I can now broadcast that globally. And again, like I said, in seconds. And now everyone can find out who I am, what kind of person I am, what my intentions are. That's humbling. And at least it should be humbling. Some people are very proud to do that. Some people are very happy to do that. And those are usually some of the more toxic voices that you see online. There is a good side, of course. Like I said, you can broadcast good things. Talk about some new cure for some disease, or some way that a church is helping some displaced group somewhere around the world because there's been a terrible flood or some other kind of catastrophe. So you can have all kinds of good uses. You can share the gospel to now billions of people. But again, it's one of those things that what it does, it's a megaphone, so it broadcasts who we are. And that's a very interesting thing to think about and wrestle with, because have you ever stopped and thought about, whenever I hit send or post, that all of a sudden potentially millions and millions and millions of people can see it? I mean, when I teach crisis communication and image management, it's one of those classes where, you come across people's misdeeds all the time. It's usually their mouths, writing checks that their butts can't cash, as the saying goes. And it's one of those things where you'll have like this famous athlete who goes out and says something immensely stupid on X or Instagram, or pick one, TikTok, does not matter, any social media platform. So they'll go out and say it. And then people will be aghast that they would say something so wrong or so mean or whatever. And they'll say, oh, that was just meant for my friends. It's like, you have 8 million followers. There's no such thing as just my friends. I mean, you're broadcasting it to the world. And if you don't have a private account, if you have an open account, it's going to anyone who can access it, not just your followers. So even if you have your Facebook account locked down, your Instagram locked down to where only your friends or followers can see what you write, you're still broadcasting to dozens or hundreds or potentially thousands, depending on how big your count is. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Like, you normally wouldn't have that opportunity. Like, how are you going to gather all of your friends together from across the country or the world and tell them something? Well, social media works for that. That's why it was invented, where we could have media, some kind of medium, in the singular medium, that I can use it to be social with lots of other people that I normally can't when I want to voice something. But, I don't have that opportunity. So now, thanks to my cell phone, I can now reach out to a whole bunch of people and say all kinds of things, good or bad. But it's an interesting time to be watching this kind of stuff unfold, because it seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. And we want to think that, again, it's social media doing it. The truth of it is it's us doing it. And that's the crux of the matter whenever I'm looking at the idea of megaphone of the soul. It's easy to blame the megaphone. I mean, because if I take the megaphone away, the problem goes away, right? Well, no, because the problem is still the person. Because people have been mean and awful to each other for a very, very long time. Like, as soon as humans existed, they've been mean and awful to each other. So I have my chance to come out of my shell and say things. What am I going to say? How am I going to use this technology? And again, that's a point for some serious soul searching. What kind of a person am I? What kind of a person do I want to be? And maybe you want to be the person who's really kind and really loving. Maybe you want to be the person that's the rude jerk. Maybe you want to be the person that just tells it like it is and just blurts out your thoughts. I mean, you can choose to do any of those things. But the point of the whole metaphor is it's up to you to choose. What's going on inside your soul? What kind of a person are you? Now, Reformed theology makes it very clear that when we study Scripture, we find out that man is inherently evil. Man's full of sin. Our hearts are factories of idols. We just continually try to find new ways to sin. You look at verse after verse after verse about the problems with our mouths. And that's one of those things that, we have to work very hard to keep it in check. And even if you're not a Christian, you recognize this. That's hard sometimes to keep your mouth in check, or your fingers and thumbs as you're typing. So the thing is, though, at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what kind of a person do I want to be? What kind of a person am I? And that's a scary question for a lot of people. I found that a lot of people, when they're alone, they pick up the phone and they start mindlessly scrolling. Because being alone is scary, because your brain starts working. You start thinking. And you start thinking deeper thoughts. But when was the last time you actually sat down, even for 5 minutes, and start critically evaluating yourself, who you are, what kind of person you are, and what kind of person you want to be? Whenever you open your mouth, you let the world know. What's the saying that it's better to be assumed you're a fool and keep your mouth shut than to open it and remove all the doubt? So people might think you're a fool, but if your mouth's shut, all they can do is guess. But as soon as you open your mouth, you're going to prove them right. And that's not exactly a good place to be. So again, I can keep my mouth shut, but can I keep my fingers off my keys? And you think about the old way of doing things. Like if I really wanted to say something to somebody who's in another town or another state, I'd pull out my pen, I'd get my piece of paper, and I'd start writing down every thought I had, and boy, I'd let them have it and say everything that was on my mind. Write it. Close up that envelope, lick that stamp and stick it on there, address it, walk down to the post office and put it in the slot. Maybe. I mean, think about all that time that happens from when I pick up the pen to when I drop it in that slot. There's a lot of time there for reflection, maybe a time to cool down, maybe time to think, maybe I shouldn't say that. With our modern cell phone technologies that we have, there's almost no time for reflection. If I'm mad, I can pick up the phone and type something and then hit send, and it's out there for the world to see. And the internet is forever. All it takes is someone to screenshot it and it's there forever. So even if you send something and then 10 seconds later you say, maybe I shouldn't. If someone's already grabbed it, it's out there and it's going to be out there forever now. Is that what you want to be? Is that the person who's reflexive and has a knee-jerk reaction and just pumps out content and, potentially hurt people? Because that's the end result. Because I've talked about the idea of megaphone of soul, and it's important to check yourself. And who am I? Well, who do I want to be? And then I go through this technology, and then there's someone on the other side. It could be the person who you're sniping, and they then feel the wrath that you sent out, and you're putting them on blast in front of the whole world. The whole world can see that you're being awful to this person. Think what that would do to the other person. And maybe you don't mind doing that, but think about all the other people that see it. I remember when Facebook came out and some of my students would post all kinds of stuff on there. It's like, what happens when a job, comes up and you apply and they Google your name and they find your Facebook account and they read that kind of stuff? What do you think they're going to think of you? If you're always sniping and saying mean things, do you think they want you there? Because you're going to bring that attitude to work. They don't want that. Why would they want that? Or your grandma sees it and her heart breaks thinking that you're that kind of a person. Again, who do you want to be? How do you really want to be treating others? Do you want to love your neighbor? Or maybe they're your enemy. Do you want to love your enemy? Maybe you don't, but you should. You should figure out how to do it. And a lot of it comes with figuring out how to keep this shut and keeping these things still. Because whether you like it or not, Communication technology is a megaphone of the soul. It's going to reflect who you are. It's going to let the world know who you are and what kind of person you are, what kind of person you want to be. And if you want to start making a change with how you use communication technologies. Because if you're quick to be an awful person, the world's going to see that and know that. And if you want to be a better person, the world will see and notice that too. That's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. I would appreciate the help with that. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thank you very much for tuning in anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.